Let me know. Okay, we're recording. Welcome everyone to Informing the Public on the Promise and Perils of Algorithms. I'll be your moderator for the evening. My name is Mike Savino. I'm a reporter with WFSB TV in Connecticut, where in this state, I'm also the president of the Connecticut Council on Freedom of Information, a group that lobbies for open government and FOI laws here in Connecticut. I'm also a member of the Society of Professional Journalists FOI committee. We are happy to put this on as part of all of our Sunshine Week projects, which this year are focusing on the issue of algorithms. And we have quite a panel here to talk about the issues surrounding algorithms and artificial intelligence. Before we get to that, I just want to invite all of you to put your questions in the chat. If you have them, just throw them in there as we go. Love to get to them as they're relevant to the conversations that we're having, as opposed to coming back to them later. So please just drop them in there as they come to you. Also, letting you all know that this is being recorded. So if you have to leave partway through, you can come back and watch it. Or if you know somebody who couldn't make it, they can certainly watch this later. As I mentioned, we have a great panel to talk about algorithms today and let you know everything you know about covering them. First, we have Michelle Gilman. She is the Venerable Professor of Law at the let me start over. Michelle Gilman is the Venerable Professor of Law at the University of Baltimore School of Law, where she directs the Civil Advocacy Clinic, supervising students representing low-income clients in a wide range of civil litigation and law reform matters. In 2019-2020, she was a faculty fellow at Data and Society, researching the intersection of data-centric technologies and privacy law and their impact on low-income communities. We also have Carrie Johnson. He is a senior artificial intelligence staff writer for VentureBeat. He's covered AI for VentureBeat for nearly 5 years, writing a mix of news at the intersection of business, ethics, and policy. In that time, he's covered a range of stories about government agencies deploying artificial intelligence, from the use of facial recognition by city governments to Prop 25, to a failed attempt to replace cash bail with algorithms, or a 2020 Stanford study that found that only 15% of AI used by federal agents are complex or recently released. Federal agencies are complex or recently released from the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. You'd think that I'd be better at this since reading is part of my job. Our last panelist is Israel Valderez, an Emmy Award-winning reporter and news documentary producer. Currently, he teaches journalism and media law at Palm Beach Atlantic University in West Palm Beach, Florida. As an attorney, his most recent pro bono work includes representing migrant children separated at the border from their families and investigating facilities used by the federal government to detain children under court order. Valderez also helped nonprofit organizations grasp the legality of applying for Small Business Administration Paycheck Protection Program loans. As a news anchor and reporter, he has worked at local TV stations in Charlotte, North Carolina, El Paso, Texas, and West Palm Beach, Florida. Valderez has also been a news producer at the Associated Press TV, Fox News Channel, Fox News Sunday, and Reuters News. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
So I think the best place to start here, since this is such a complex issue, is just getting a better understanding of algorithms, what they are, and how they're constructed. We'll start with you, Michelle, and just give us a quick idea of what obviously they could do a million things, but what are algorithms and how are they constructed?
Right. Well, an algorithm is just a set of mathematical instructions that tell a computer what to do. And they could be very straightforward, just having a computer apply a preset list of rules, or they could involve more complex processes like machine learning, where the programmer instructs the computer to identify correlations, which then further train the computer. So when we're talking about algorithms, not everything is AI, artificial intelligence. And while these distinctions can be subtle, I'm going to put a link in the chat to a report that I wrote at Data and Society that provides very user-friendly basic definitions of many of these concepts. And I hope that that will be a helpful resource for your listeners. But one concept to really keep in mind, and I'm sure Carrie Carrie and Israel will talk about this as well, is just because a computer is making a decision doesn't mean it's correct. Computers are not magic. They are only as good as the programmers who tell them what to do. So all the mistakes and biases that humans have can be baked into algorithms. So really, if there was only one takeaway for the reporters tonight, it's don't be lured into this idea that just because the computer said something, it's right. And we'll talk a lot tonight about the reasons why that's not true, but a very healthy dose of skepticism will serve you very well in reporting on these issues.
And you know, before we leave, what obviously we're going to get into all of that. Before we leave it, I don't know if Carrie or Israel or even Michelle, if you want to jump back in and just, you know, briefly, you know, you said it's a small difference between algorithms and artificial intelligence, and there's certainly a lot of overlap here, but why is it important to make that distinction between those two things?
Well, I think one thing that Michelle mentioned that stuck out to me is, you know, people, they're not magic, definitely, but the idea of, we have to understand that there are phenomena like automation bias where people will get to a point where they just trust it. And that's where I think a lot of danger is. There are tests happening now with people who are in like critical settings, like in hospitals. I read a story about a month ago on how showing doctors uncertainty scores or certainty score or confidence scores for predictions related to healthcare, how that shapes their behavior. There's a human behavior when it relates to this information that's shown to us by the computer that we have to understand that's part of it as well. The technology is definitely, plays a big role, and there's a distinction to be drawn between a basic algorithm, let's say, that's being used for deciding if somebody gets a bail or not, or something like deep learning systems used for making all manner of predictions by a federal agency.
Right. And, again, as journalists, the reason we went into journalism is because maybe we were bad in math. So I get the apprehension by some journalists to venture into algorithms because they see that and they get scared. I think at the basic level, right? It's just basically taking inputs and then producing outputs, right? You're taking the information and then you're using the information to sometimes do prediction. The problem is you've got three types of concerns, right? The first one would be biased data. This is data that has been built on discrimination. The classic example is how police do investigations and questioning of suspects, right? There is a method called the Reed method that's been used by police departments for decades. But the data shows that type of method has internal biases. So when we're reporting on algorithms, it's not only important to say, here's what it is, right? Basic in, out, but it's the information that may be biased. The other problem is the context of the data. It's one thing to say, all applicants need to be screened for health disparities. Got it. There's no discrimination in that. But in law, there's a thing called disparate impact. And that is, how do different groups, especially marginalized groups, get impact by that, right? So yes, everyone is looked upon directly with health disparities. But we know the data shows that African Americans, Latinos, and women are often impacted more severely with health than white communities, right? So there's the context and there's the bias of the data. And for reporters, what we want to do is we want to explain to the public why those two are concerns for everybody.
I'll add a third to that awesome list that Israel pointed out. I represent low-income clients, often who are trying to get public benefits from a state agency, and increasingly algorithms determine whether people are eligible. Algorithms screen people for fraud. Algorithms have replaced human caseworkers in many respects. One thing I know as a lawyer is if I open the federal or state codes governing public benefits law, they're incredibly complex. My law students are pulling their hair out trying to understand the complexities of these statutes and regulations. I tell my students, this is like the tax code for poor people, okay? So when those codes, when those legal codes have to get translated into computer code, oh my goodness, so many opportunities for mistakes, because now we're relying on a computer programmer to interpret ambiguities, gray areas, complexities, exceptions in law. And we know that there have been hundreds and hundreds of coding mistakes that have cut off poor, sick people with life and death consequences from benefits to which they were eligible. Because again, the translation from legal code to computer code is very, very fraught.
And Carrie, we've heard each of you already lay out some of the ways that algorithms are used by government to make decisions, which of course is what we're interested in here today. How big of a decision can be made by an algorithm? I mean, what is the scale potentially that algorithms can be doing government functions, making government decisions?
Yeah, so I mean, a good example of that, the National Security Commission on AI final report came out about a week ago, and one of the recommendations was to pull together some sort of international pact not to automate launching nuclear weapons. And I'm like, yeah, we're all into that. I think we can all get on the same page.
You don't want a computer glitch to start a nuclear holocaust.
No, which there is historical, I forget his name, but the Russian man who saved a lot of lives from not pressing that button happened, and to avert nuclear war. But that to the point of how bad could it get? There's that. And there's use for, I believe it was the Compass algorithm, I could be wrong,
Yes.
that was used during, to understand who gets to go home during COVID-19 from, I believe, federal prisons. And that was found to have racial bias. So, that's a real immediate reflection of how that can be used in government. But I think what's really important to point out as well is the amount of private partnerships that are involved in this, or private companies that are involved in the space. A really clear example that we got from that today was the news that we got from Kashmir Hill at the New York Times on Clearview AI. Clearview AI is a company that is, it made its facial recognition by scraping billions of images from social media and video sites. And it's a year ago, it was said that it would kill privacy by doing this. And there was a lot of not bad reporting, it was great reporting by, all manner of outlets. But at the end of the day, Clearview AI is continuing to grow, and it's growing, it would appear, focused on government contracts with to police departments, multiple military branches, I believe, are using it, and public prosecutors, I believe, in New York have began using Clearview AI. So there's a really direct correlation, I think, in some instances, to the government contracts that are grabbed up by private companies, especially in surveillance. And we're seeing that, of course, on the border as well for the, what's the name of this company? Palmer Luckey's old company, Anduril, I believe. So I think that the private sector plays a large role as well.
And Michelle, you're flooding the chat with a lot of these stories as Kari's talking about them. I mean, it seems like he's talking, he's providing some high-profile examples in national security, but it seems like this can touch any aspect of life in any department within government.
Yeah, and within the private context, as Kari just said, my perspective is a social justice perspective because I represent low-income people, and that's where my research is based. And I can have any one client at any time ensnared in multiple algorithmic systems. So as a tenant, my client will be captured in tenant screening algorithms, which are, commercial products that where data is scraped by data brokers, tenants are assigned like a creditworthiness score, and then landlords buy those reports to decide who to rent to. That same person will be subject to different credit scoring and other consumer reports. They may be dealing with government algorithms in applying for food stamps or Medicaid or cash assistance. They might be involved in the family law system where child welfare algorithms are starting to be used. Kids in school are under incredible amounts of algorithmic surveillance where companies are looking at kids' homework, social media postings, and email and trying to do algorithmic analyses to assess safety risks. So there's almost no domain in which I practice law and in which my clients are just passing through on their daily lives where there isn't some sort of algorithmic judgment being made about them, which in turn shapes their life opportunities and their life chances. And it's commercial, it's government, and those spheres aren't that separate anymore because Carrie already highlighted the government is buying information from data brokers to fuel its algorithms, and data brokers are buying government data, such as your driver's license photo to feed facial recognition technologies. So it's very synergistic and interconnected, and increasingly so.
Are we cool with that, Israel? I mean, you're a lawyer who works with marginalized groups, and of course, you're a reporter who's spent a career on uncovering this stuff. Are we cool with things being so automated?
Well, and here's going to be the difficulty for reporters, right? And here I'll break up print reporters and TV reporters, right? Because let me address both, because sometimes both have different needs and different difficulties. Jennifer Paris, she's here watching, and she is a FOIA analyst for the federal government, right? So as reporters, we got to take a 360 approach to this issue, right? Michelle just pointed out there are so many people that need to know how often their lives, their well-being, their welfare is being impacted by AI's algorithms. On the other end, right, there are plenty of stories out there where governments, local and federal governments, can say, look, what we're doing is we're improving education, right? We're taking large amounts of data and we're trying to be more efficient. We're trying to make sure that the menial tasks of government is handled by computers, and the more difficult, nuanced tasks are handled by humans. And that's right? We, as reporters, we got to look at both sides, and we got to report both sides. We just can't say that this is all bad. Plenty of stories out there, including that report in the New York Times and Clearview, as they pointed out. Some people accused of crimes were found and identified because of using Clearview's technology. However, because this is Sunshine Week, the problem comes in if I'm having a discussion with Jennifer. I say, but Jennifer, the federal government is not being transparent, right? They're not opening up their books to say, look, here's who created the data. Here's the historical context of the data. Here's the output, and we can show that the output is not being discriminatory. And so as journalists, what we have to do is we have to go out and talk to people, right? We got to take sort of that approach of reporting. Al Tompkins at the Poynter Institute says, when you report, you got to address, how is this going to impact my money, my family, my safety, my health, my community, sometimes moral outrage, right? What's trending. So what we have to do as reporters is we got to go out and find people that are being impacted. And we got to find out, is that good or is that bad? Michelle just pointed out, it can tend to be bad, but then it tends to be good as well. And as TV reporters, we also have to show the visual. How do we tell these stories in a way that makes sense, right? Because we need the B-roll, we need the sound bites, we need the visuals. And finally, we got to hold government accountable, Michael, because as you've been doing some good work up in Connecticut, the problem is that these local governments are not willing, right, to take our request so that we can see not just the data, but the output of that data.
And it's just as
sorry.
frustrating for lawyers trying to find out what's happening to our clients, because when you ask for the materials, the source code or an explanation, you get hit with trade secrecy claims. Even if you make your FOIA request. And so there are a lot of law reform efforts around what do we do about that, but expect to be stonewalled. That will be the norm. And a lot of it is when the government signed its procurement contract for the algorithm, which was probably designed by a private vendor rather than in-house, the government agreed to assert that trade secrecy defense on behalf of the maker. And so the maker's not going to give it to you, and the government agency is not going to give it to you. And that is anti-democratic. It lacks transparency. It lacks accountability. It's contrary to all of our American norms. And yet companies and government agencies are getting away with it every day. And it's a way also to make new law without telling the public what's going on, because as I mentioned earlier, these algorithms sort of encode policy decisions in them. So it's definitely a huge problem. And by your field shining a light on these issues, and even the stonewalling is very, very helpful to law reform efforts to change laws in this regard.
And
Yeah.
Michael, can I add something real quick? Because
Yeah.
I want to explain to reporters what Michelle just beautifully put, right? And that is, look, these software companies, they are private entities, right? So again, when it comes to private entities, freedom of information requests don't apply, okay? So anytime we as reporters say, dear government, open up your books, we put a request and we say, sunshine laws, open records request, all those things. What the governments will then say is, okay, but that's not ours. That is someone else created that software. And what lawyers and reporters should say is, well, I wonder if private companies become state actors, meaning they're not government, but they're kind of government because they are doing government services type of work, whether that should be now forcing private companies to reveal their information. That's for a law type of discussion. Here's what I would say to both the government workers, the journalists, and the attorneys, right? There is this thing in law, in American law, called administrative law. And what administrative law says, anytime the government is going to do anything to impact your rights, they've got to tell you why. They've got to give you a reason why, right? They've got to be transparent. They got to be accountable. So what we have to have is this dialogue, me with Jennifer, who's watching, to say, if you want the public to trust you, you, government, can hide behind this software is not ours. There's going to have to be a partnership between the public sector and the private sector to say, if you want us to trust you, you got to open up what you're doing. Full transparency.
We could certainly get into the transparency part of this later. As you mentioned, that could be a whole discussion on its own. But Carrie, I wanted to get back to some of the stuff that Israel was just talking about reporters. I mean, you're in this space, you're an expert in this field as a reporter, but for a journalist who's on, sort of a general local beat or city hall beat where they're covering everything, what's a good way to start finding this stuff out? I mean, Israel talked about going out and talking to people. They may not even know that they're the victim of an algorithmic bias. They may just feel like, hey, I somehow got screwed by the government. How do you start to uncover these? And then how do you start to become an expert? Because you're going to get pushback, whether it's from the public agency, the software company, someone's going to push back and say that that's wrong, that's not correct. So how do you start to become comfortable in reporting on these things and exposing them and knowing that your reporting is good?
Well, I think it would begin with, the sort of conversations that you're going to have with like private vendors or anything like that. You want to be, or anyone about the AI they're using, you want to have an understanding of, what kind of data are you using? How is it obtained? Get into the details surrounding how it's being deployed, and try and gain some understanding in those different areas. I think what helps me is following people who are doing great reporting on it, and the best example I think we have of algorithm and government reporting goes back to that 2016 ProPublica article, which I can put it into the link there if that's.
Oh, I popped it in there. It's there.
Yeah, that's the classic one, right? But it's I think it requires in general just scrutiny and the expectation that it might be used and the expectation that you're not hearing about it being used, because there are few regulations out there that would require such a thing. I mean, we were talking earlier about Clearview and the prospect of I watched a lot of the congressional hearings around the use of facial recognition, and it really hit me that Elijah Cummings, back when they had some of these hearings a couple years ago, was talking about use of facial recognition at protests in 2015 in Baltimore, and things of that nature. And it's like, I don't ever want to be in a place. I don't think this country ever wants to be in a place where we're like, facial recognition at protest. The Clearview piece was talking about it being used in some sort of political oppo research and to some degree and things like that. But the average person being afraid to go to a protest because facial recognition is being used is terrifying, and it's a articulation of how little regulation is around this. One last thing I'll say though, there's the entire issue of who's liable, and liability law is going to be greatly challenged and looked at, and I'll put a link in the chat about that. I wrote a piece about, there was a long law review article on that ahead of the trial that's going to begin soon for the the driver who was in the Uber car who killed a woman a couple years ago. There's we're going to see large challenges to law that happens, or at least instances where I think in the last year in places like Holland and Italy and the UK, courts have ruled use of algorithms in providing services to people human rights violations, and so I think we're going to see a lot more of that. But as it relates to the giving people a way to actually do something about it when you are harmed by an algorithm, giving people an access as a path to redress of some sort, I think that's something that we're also going to see evolve. And the best example that I've seen of that as it relates to just good policy is I think the cities of Amsterdam and Helsinki created an algorithm list for their local government. And so it would have to list, one, what algorithms are being used by your government, and two, which agency and member of your local government is in charge for the deployment of that algorithm. That's not something I think we all know right now. Who's in charge of putting this thing out there? A lot of places that's not common knowledge, and I think that's something that I hope that as journalists we get a lot better at, so that we can bring that accountability in Sunshine.
Another lawsuit that I'll mention to build on what Carrie said is going to be underway in Connecticut, Michael. And it's a fair housing lawsuit where housing advocates and a tenant are challenging a tenant screening algorithm for having a disparate impact, which Israel already described in terms of discriminating against people of color and people who have criminal records. And this is one of the first frontal attacks on a commercial algorithm. So that will be a very interesting precedent-setting case to follow.
Yeah, and I mean, to Kari's point about inventory, I was going to save this for the transparency thing, but since it came up, here in Connecticut, we're actually trying to work on that now. The group that I'm president of, we're working to get our Office of Legislative Research here in Connecticut to do that inventory in Connecticut, just to find out state agencies who's using algorithms and why. And then, it could be that the next step is just asking agencies to explain what evaluation even they're making when they pick these considerations for negative impacts. But sticking with you, Michelle, for a second, I mean, back to helping journalists just understand this really complicated field. As my group's doing advocacy, we're finding experts. I mean, obviously here in Connecticut, we have Yale, which has experts in any field you could think of. But I mean, there's experts all around the country in this, right? Like they don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's partners with the ACLU as well. I mean, they can reach out to groups to get a quick 101 on some of this stuff.
Absolutely. There are some very prominent tech research institutes that could be helpful, such as Data and Society, where I was lucky to be a faculty fellow, AI Now, the Algorithmic Justice League, the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard. So there are many of these think tanks that are researching these issues and putting out reports whose researchers would love to talk to you. They live to get these stories into the media in the hopes of having, an informed citizenry and, public policy impacts. There are professors who specialize in this area all across the country, from folks who specialize in national security to social justice like myself, to privacy law, to criminal justice. So no need to recreate the wheel. And please understand that folks working in this space are desperate to have the media amplify what we're seeing. No one is going to say no to you. No one is going to say, I don't have time. We are doing this work to effectuate change in the world, and you are the most powerful disseminators of this research and knowledge.
And Israel just shared in the chat the link to our project this year on algorithmic transparency. Of course, Israel, as Carrie was pointing out, the best place to start is probably the work that other journalists are doing and seeing where they're finding these problems, right?
Was that to me or to Carrie?
I was going to throw that to you.
Oh, because I saw Carrie's hand up. So
yeah. I mean, if you want to
jump step on him. Yes, we've put together this website. I think I can share. Yeah, I can share. Here we go. This is the website that the FOIA committee put together. Michelle was talking about experts. We've got a section on sources, experts that you can interview, what their expertise is in. I want to add to this the Brookings. The Brookings Institute has done amazing work bringing together panelists on local government use of algorithms, the concerns, where there should be reform in this area. The other thing would be story ideas, and this was the section that I put together. These are story ideas from across the country that you can look at and then say, how can we localize this story? And I've put all kinds of people and areas that are being impacted by algorithms: public housing, immigration, unemployment benefits, food stamps, right? Traffic tickets, how police officers are monitoring a certain section of the freeway. And then, how can reporters sort of track who's using what? I put a story in there from the LA Times regarding how LAPD kept saying that they weren't using facial recognition until a reporter started asking, well, are you using facial recognition programs from other local agencies, county, state? And it turned out that yes, they were using state police monitoring systems. And that was a good example where the LAPD just kept pushing away journalists. So to your point, Michael, we've put a lot of resources here so that reporters can come and then say to the news director or to the managing editor, I think we can take this story and localize it here in our jurisdiction.
And Carrie, I knew you had your hand up. Go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, as it relates to just sort of advice for journalists who are covering algorithms, I would suggest getting on Signal as well if you're not. There appears to be an appetite for more whistleblowing in this area, as well, and appetite for more whistleblower protection laws. That's something that came up at Google recently. The previously mentioned National Security Commission on AI report also suggested this, and they were talking about that they would like to see all government agencies critical to national security have some sort of path for employees to come forward and to report either misuse of AI or inappropriate development and things of that nature. So I think, and speaking personally, I've spoken to a fair amount of people who have run into unethical applications of AI and wanted to talk about that. And so I think being on Signal might not be a bad idea, for sure.
And I'll give a quick plug to another SPJ Sunshine Week project, the Whistleblower Project from a couple of years ago, which is tips for journalists on how to deal with whistleblowers, some ways to help share information that's encrypted. So obviously, we don't want to get our sources in trouble with their jobs. So that's another tool that relates here. We've obviously been talking a lot about the concerns with algorithms being biased, and Israel touched at the beginning some of the ways that they can be biased. But I want to get back to that and maybe delve a little deeper in that quickly, because it would be easy for a government agency to throw up their hands up and just say, listen, this is an algorithm. It's being figured out by a computer or a software program. How can that be biased? And really, the algorithm itself is doing what it was designed to do. So how are biases getting baked in? Anybody who wants to jump in and start off?
Yes, I would love to. For those of you who know Ibram X. Kendi, he's a professor and he teaches on matters of race. He had a really good article in The Lancet. For those of you who want to read it, the headline was, all policies, even the most trivial, are either racist or anti-racist. And what he did is he looked at a study published in Science. So again, this is data that you can use as fact. What he showed was that there was a healthcare software that was being used by Optum. It's a health services company. And what they were looking was using an algorithm to identify high-risk patients for complex health needs. And so somebody would say, well, how can that be biased, right? Well, what the data showed was that the algorithm assigned risk scores to patients based on total healthcare cost accrued in 1 year. And what ended up happening was that the data showed that the healthcare provider provided to Black people cost on average $1,800 less per year than whites, which anybody who's done any kind of critical work in healthcare delivery knows that's not possible. But why did that happen? Well, as Ibram pointed out, the data didn't take into account historical data and context. So to your question, Michael, how can the algorithm be biased? It's because it doesn't take a 360 approach to very complex issues. It only takes maybe one set of data. And who are the people that are inputting the data? They themselves could have internal biases, right? Things that we have picked up along the way. And so you've got two avenues of bias. One, the person inputting the data, and then two, the data itself that hasn't been given a 360 approach to say, is this accurate?
I'll talk about another famous example, which a couple of years ago, Amazon was trying to develop a recruiting algorithm for its engineers. And the algorithm was trained to review resumes to identify which ones would be more successful. And it was trained on the data of the prior 10 years of resumes of employees of that division. And what the algorithm trained itself to do was to hire only men. Because if by the training data was primarily men, because men predominate in the tech industry, it learned to prefer men over women. So resumes that had anything related to the word women or served as a proxy for femaleness were churned out. To their credit, Amazon, it was an experiment. They did not deploy this algorithm, but there was no intent to discriminate Here, they were intending to hire people who had a profile likely to succeed at the company. But it was fed a set of data that embedded a historical and structural bias.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've seen recently that I write about a lot of AI research, and there was a piece of research about a week or two ago on people who identify as queer, and the lack of data collection in, let's say, a healthcare setting, really putting them at risk in that environment, because not only can you not tell what kind of bias is there, you can't detect it. You know, there's just no detection of anything. You can't tell them that no bias has happened. There are and this is a paper written by DeepMind researchers, some of them who identify as queer, and it got into particular bias issues that can be identified, or for people who identify that way, you know, and it being an unobservable characteristic, and other people with unobservable characteristics could suffer similar issues. Another big one is something that doesn't always come up, is essentially most object detection systems. These are ones that's a pot, that's a flower, whatever, are trained primarily on images that came from the United States and Europe. So if you ever brought this into any nation that's considered part of the global South, then its accuracy rates are going to drop by a great number, because that's not present in the training data. So that's another example of that. And then the last one that comes to mind on the hiring side is one that was high profile within the last couple of years, is a company called HireView that was it got into trouble with, I believe, federal regulators at some point when some complaints were filed. But essentially, you're talking about they were trying to use facial expression in some interviews. Not all interviews use this software, in my understanding in the conversations of the company. But effectively, they'd be able to say if somebody didn't smile enough in an interview, that would be something that would change what their score should be.
Yeah.
But if you've seen some of the work that I believe there was a group of German journalists who did it, if you changed your background in some way, let's say you put a bookshelf in your background, or you put a pair of glasses on, it would change the characteristics setting, score that it gave you, which obviously is garbage. So, I think there's a lot of space within the AI conversation about how things can be done that can get us to a place, where government is doing positive things with it. But there's so much space for peddling garbage and peddling things that are just there to get a government contract.
And I feel like the example Carrie is talking about, which was this software that analyzed video interviews, it's a pseudoscience. Here they are, the maker is telling companies, we can predict who will be a successful, hardworking employee who will stick around your company based on how many times they blink, their facial expressions, their tone of voice, their body language. That is not backed by science. It's pseudoscience. It sounds fancy, but it's not the real deal, and that's why they're getting into trouble. I think a new frontier that's similar, and Israel and I are in higher education, so this will be very resonant for us, all this proctoring software. Now that students at K through higher ed are at home, these vendors are going crazy, selling proctoring software to educational institutions, claiming that they can tell when a student taking an exam online is cheating or not. And that is so problematic for so many reasons, partly because of the way it may encode how disabled students are interacting in front of the camera, partly because facial recognition technology is famously bad at identifying people of color. So there are all sorts of potential problems and biases baked into those tools, but man, is it a big market. It's a moneymaker, but it's time for everyone to take a deep breath because kids are being falsely accused of cheating who upon investigation absolutely were not cheating. Yeah. And so, it's just, there is no scenario under which I would ever use one of these technologies with my own students. None. I'd rather just give them an open book, open note exam because the problems for marginalized groups with that technology are extremely problematic. But, it pops every day, a new one of these technologies pops up, a new market is found, a new profit-making opportunity. And so you all will have no shortage of stories that I'm confident of.
There's a huge scandal actually in the United Kingdom. It's not the exact same thing where they tried to use algorithms because the school year was cut short to figure out who would have passed and failed. And it was so blatantly biased towards people of color that they just had to throw it out and stop using it because of how problematic it was.
People in the UK were literally protesting, holding signs saying F the algorithm. I mean, mass social protests, which we could use some more of those here in the US.
I will say that's the only time that I've ever seen that before. A crowd of people gathered chanting F the algorithm.
There was one other, and that was recently at Stanford Medical Center. They adopted the vaccine algorithm, and it was prioritizing the vaccines for senior doctors, most of whom were still working at home doing telemedicine, and the frontline residents did not get the vaccines, and they protested in their white coats, very similar. It wasn't on the scale of the UK, but there's good video of them that I saw on Twitter, same, the signs, the protests, and Stanford had to acknowledge that it was not a well-designed tool and they revamped it. But again, there was no intent to discriminate against medical residents, but the outcome was discriminatory. And again, that goes back to what Israel talked about earlier about disparate impact. It doesn't have to have a bad or evil intent to really, really harm people.
And a good reflection of that is the state bar exams in a lot of places were done with the remote proctoring tests as well. And I believe it was in California, the Electronic Frontier Foundation found that a third of the tests were flagged for some sort of cheating. Crazy. And if you're, let's say you have dark skin and you're in front of this facial recognition algorithm and it's, there to see if you're cheating, maybe you're more likely to get flagged. Somebody with disabilities, that, as you said before, maybe they're more likely to get flagged. So maybe they're, state bar. It's pretty wild to think about that. But that's definitely data that is out there and stories around those state bar exams that have been happening in the last 6 months.
Yeah. And even though a lot of these technologies are being adopted, during the pandemic, we are in a health crisis, they're going to stick around, right? So all these expansions we've had of workplace surveillance and school surveillance, now they've become normalized. And so don't expect them to go away. They'll be expanding and creeping into new markets.
So how do we create transparency around there? Obviously, we've been touching on this throughout, and we raised the issue of, if you just try to submit an FOI request, you're going to get denied because of trade secrets. I've actually run into that here in Connecticut, where it was even government, the Department of Economic and Community Development was using a simulator, the REMI model. It's a simulator for economic impact when they were trying to determine the tax benefits that they would offer to Amazon during the whole HQ2 process. They claimed that was a trade secret because it would make them have a disadvantage versus other states. So the trade secret thing is really going to be a problem here. You're probably going to get a huge fight if you try to just say, no, that doesn't work anymore. That's not an exemption that applies. Is there some middle ground we can shoot for in the meantime? Is it cataloging the use? I mean, what are some of the things that we can do to try to create transparency around the use of algorithms?
I think there are, without getting access to the data or the algorithm or the code or anything like that, you can test the hell out of it. There are, the definition of what an algorithm audit is can be vastly different. But some form of testing and standards around that, I feel like, are ways that we could get to a place where people feel safe and that they have some sort of, like I said, some option and redress when things go wrong. I think there's a lot of policy around this stuff that just doesn't even exist yet, you know, and there's a lot of conversations about what that should look like. I think one of the craziest things I saw this week, the co-founder of OpenAI is talking about tax policy and a constitutional amendment. And it's like, you're a startup founder. Like, you know, it's, I respect your opinion, but, you know, I think it just really, it articulates how much policy is blending in with this technology. Yeah, it's pretty wild.
And here's what I would say for journalists. Just like newsrooms have education reporters, crime reporters, right? I think journalists should go into their managing editor or their news director and say, I want to start being the government by algorithms reporter, because this is going to be a huge area. Governments are using algorithms. That's the bottom line, okay? Everyone's using algorithms. How do we get to it? One of the things that you can do is you can ask for an open records request of any and all software to police departments over the last year and a half. You can also request emails sent. There's always going to be a person at the local level, at the state level, that gets all the marketing emails for softwares and does all the buying for that local agency. Go and request the emails, open records, that should be easy. And then look at the emails and look at who's marketing to what, because an algorithm probably said, hey, West Palm Beach, they bought software. Now let's send marketing emails to that person over and over again. That will let you know how much software they've bought. The other thing too, you can ask for open records is once they bought that software, who tried it out, where was it implemented, how did it go, how was it used, and what was the outcome. The best thing that I can tell for reporters is think of this as a long-term plan. For TV reporters, this would be great sweep pieces for November. And you can start now doing open records for all this information. And then finally, you're going to have to be the best fair reporter you can be. You got to have conversations with government officials, and you got to let them know, look, if you're doing some good work, tell me about it, but then let me hold you accountable to it, right? Let someone from the outside see it. And you've got to be accurate on the terms. You've got to be accurate on the science, and don't report things that don't make sense. There are myths and there are misrepresentations out there when it comes to AI that as a reporter, you've got to know and you've got to avoid, right? There's no such thing as an algorithm that is without human decision-making. There is human decision-making. Don't talk about mutant algorithms taking over the world. You know, there is such a thing as a machine learning black box that is very powerful, but at the local level, that's not happening, right? And then you've got to look at the data as a journalist and say, is this being useful or not? But I really believe that for journalists like Carrie, who's doing this and who's done amazing work, you've got to talk to everybody and try to call it fair as much as possible.
Should we also, I mean, obviously that particular journalist who's doing that work should stay out of this, but we've been having a lot of talk at SPJ as well about advocacy by journalists. We're working on a project for journalists to do advocacy. I call it lobbying because I call it what it is, but we don't like the word lobbying. But should journalists also get more involved in advocating for transparency in terms of policy and state laws? Because I justify what I do because if we don't do it, very few people will advocate for transparency for the sake of transparency. So is there room for journalists doing it ethically, but to do it?
No, I think that's a tough place because that conversation is being had across newsrooms not related to algorithms, right? You've got Wesley Lowery, 60 Minutes correspondent, former Washington Post reporter. He wrote an op-ed piece last summer talking about how journalists should have more moral clarity in reporting. And then you have the authors of the Elements of Journalism who said, look, there is still an important need for objectivity. Objectivity understood from a scientific point of view, right? From the 20th century point of view. That's what I teach my students. You got to be the best umpire possible. Now, can we advocate for the First Amendment? Absolutely. Journalists are defenders of the First Amendment. Why? Because we believe that more information out there improves democracy, and democracy, right, helps society to be better met. We can do that. But to advocate for a certain outcome, you know, Michael, you and I, we would have conversations, and I would say, as a journalism professor, I'm a little leery. Can someone leave the day-to-day reporting and as a journalist be an advocate for our industry? Absolutely. But it's going to be tough to say, I'm going to try to report as fair as possible, you know, the good and the bad of algorithms and AI, while at the same time say, but, you know, you government agencies, you know, you are up to something bad. You can be a mistrustful journalist. That's what we do. We are offering critical thinking skills. But at the same time, when we're asking for transparency, I think we should do it in the view of Sunshine Week, in the view of open records. I'm not so sure if we should ask for a specific policy outcome, but that's an opinion. Remember, I'm a journalism professor.
I think it's okay to have, you know, opinions as it relates to AI shouldn't be discriminatory, or AI should be human-centered, you know, for lack of a better term, you know, because it's not always centered on people, or that, you know, it's that it shouldn't harm democracy. I think we're supposed to, you know, that's what the fourth estate is for, to say those things, those particular things. Yeah, you know,
right.
Where and when it should be used is for, you know, your elected officials to decide, I suppose, right? But I do think that there are some basic things that I think it's okay to advocate for, and it certainly, when it comes to covering some of these tech companies, I think they should be treated like nation states, or with high levels of scrutiny, and that techno-optimism should die. It has no place in our society today. I feel like there's way too much risk involved without being vocal about that. But I hear what you're saying, that the policy side is there are people whose job it is to make those choices who'll be elected.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. We do need to be skeptical of both, you know, the masters of the universe in Silicon Valley and the decision makers in Washington, D.C. Absolutely. And I think you're right. As journalists, when we see that the government is doing something that is impacting people's lives, that's just part of our job to say, right? The individual is being harmed by such decision making. I don't think that's activism. I think that's journalism standing up and being both a sword and a shield, as Michelle would say. The law is both a sword and a shield. And I think journalists, they use that pen or that camera for both a sword and a shield, right? To defend and to go after people who are abusing marginalized voices, marginalized communities. That's our job, to hold people accountable. Not just government, but as Carrie said, these big companies that we know now, they almost pattern a surveillance state.
Yeah. There's a question in the chat as we're on this issue of transparency, picking back up on the idea of freedom of information records requests, basically trying to just figure out how to streamline it. You know, they bring up the example of, you know, if you were trying to make a request to the local Department of Labor or whatever the equivalent is in your state, they're probably going to be swamped right now with unemployment claims. Other agencies can probably make similar claims. I know for me, I've also run into the issue of some people are working remotely, some people are working from home. With software, maybe it's a little bit easier because it's computerized, but that sometimes is used as a delay tactic. What are some ways that you would suggest that people maybe focus their requests? I mean, you know, Israel, you brought up one example of looking specifically for offers from vendors and purchases. Are there other key words or things you can use to help streamline your request, make it faster so that you don't end up with litigation to try your request?
Yeah, I'm looking at that question. Amos said, unemployment agencies strategies on how to get the most out of open records process. What I would do if I were working this beat is I would go to agencies that they're using algorithms. Unemployment agencies, housing. These are agencies that are already using it, and Michelle could probably tell you all the different agencies. I would find people, I would just park it outside and I would talk to people and I would say, look, what are you here to get X help or Y help? And they'll say yes. And then what I would do is I would get their information and I would say, do I have permission to see how the process has worked out for you? And I think we all know that open records request often takes a month, 2 months. I saw someone on Muckrack looking at the Atlanta Police Department just to see what software they were buying. It took 11 months for that open records request for the Atlanta Police, and then finally it came out. So this is going to take a long time. You're going to have to be very patient, but I think the best way is to find the people that are being impacted by algorithms. Michelle, she probably knows 100 people. Those people should become, good friends with journalists. Follow that person's records, solicit or ask with permission for those people's processes.
I can't get the Department of Labor to return my calls either for my clients with unemployment insurance claims. So this is a problem right now. I mean, Amos is, hitting a point that a lot of agencies are in crisis mode right now, particularly human service, social service agencies. So I can relate to what you're talking about, really struggling to get their attention. It doesn't mean they should be off the hook though. But you might have to litigate it like that. That may really be the only way.
Michael, what about you? I mean, I'd love to get your take on this because I know you're the moderator, but let me turn the mic on you because, I mean, you're in the trenches. You're both a reporter and you're trying to bring transparency just in Connecticut. Can you talk about how difficult it has been and what are some of the strategies you've used as a TV reporter?
So, I mean, it certainly has been difficult, especially in the pandemic, as we've all talked about, to try to get FOI requests done in a timely manner. I haven't filed too many in this realm, but just in general, I think some of it too has to go with your relationship with that agency and the nature of your request. If you find that like yours really is more of an inquisitive, I'm just curious to know who's using algorithms, and you can talk to the agency about like, hey, this is, maybe I worded it wrong, but this is kind of what I'm looking for. If you feel like that agency will work with you, at least on that initial request, because it's not as combative as I'm trying to uncover a problem here. Obviously, if you know that there's going to be pushback, I think Israel's example is great, that it's a great way to narrow what you're looking for while still getting what you're looking for. Also, don't be afraid to be narrow at first, be specific, look for something like what Israel is pointing out, find a specific example. And then if you have to file a second request, a third request to build out your story of, okay, I know this is here, but I need to find the software company. I need to find this, I need to find that. Just file more requests. And, the other thing, to Michelle's point, at the end of the day, if you have to litigate it, you have to litigate it. If the story is really worth litigating it, then, it's frustrating, it's time consuming. You may have to fight with your editors or your producers to get that time and, perhaps get the money for a lawyer if needed. But at the end of the day, if it's worth it, you may just have to go into a courtroom and slug it out. I say that coming from Connecticut, we have a different, much more user-friendly process where we have a Freedom of Information Commission that is outside of the court system. So you don't really get slogged down in court. It's a little bit easier. But sometimes I also find it worthwhile that if I know an agency is intentionally, I've done this with state police here in Connecticut, who we gave them the Black Hole Award last year, because one of the things they do is they intentionally drag out complaints. So I knew they were doing this to me. I let them drag it out for something I didn't even care about, took them to the commission, and they were cited for doing exactly that, just not caring at all about FOI requests. A couple other people did the same thing. Eventually they got fined because there's now a track record of them doing this. So there's all kinds of different strategies that you have to think about here, where sometimes the litigation may ultimately be worthwhile because you've got judges ordering them to do this, so that in the future they can't push back. There's a judge's order that says, no, this very thing is public. So, it's a case-by-case thing. As frustrating as it is to have to go to court, sometimes that's worthwhile.
And there have been some litigation success stories in this space, in terms of lawyers being able to get their hands on algorithms despite trade secrecy claims. So there is starting to be good precedent in this area, and it just needs to be built upon and litigated in more places.
Right, which has value. You may not be able to make headway with legislation to get transparency, but a judge's order is just as good. So sometimes that, there are benefits there beyond the story that you've now set a precedent. So, sometimes you just have to go that route. I want to move along to, the last question, which is how to make artificial intelligence less biased. And as Israel has pointed out, obviously, as journalists, it's not our role. Even when I talk about advocacy, I'm talking about literally transparency for the sake of transparency. It is not our role to advocate for outcomes other than to show that a particular group is being harmed. But, can journalists play a role here? I'm assuming yes, in showing a problem and helping to make it less biased. What is our role in sort of generally, how do we make algorithms less biased?
Sunshine. The more you tell people stories of how algorithms are impacting them, the more policymakers and activists and advocates and lawyers can get involved on these issues. So just talking about it is really, really powerful. I mean, some of the examples we talked about tonight, like Carrie talked about the interviewing software, the proctoring software, we talked about a lot of these areas. After it broke in the news, agencies started getting interested, started doing investigations, lawyers started bringing lawsuits. So a lot of the movement in this space has been because of journalists and investigative reports.
Yeah, and I would say, so there are three areas, and you can talk to people who are doing work in this space. One, there's legal accountability. I think it would be right to ask for some kind of judicial review of agency action, meaning that whatever the agency is doing, that there should be an outside court or some body that is not related to the executive branch, making sure and checking in, right? There's got to be some checks and balances there. You got to have political accountability. As journalists, we can do that. There's got to be some kind of public ventilation, that there's got to be notice and comment about what's being adopted. And so again, for us, this is why we're pushing this at SPJ, because we believe that over the next 3 to 5 years, this is going to be a big issue. And then finally, to make sure that governments are not using models that have been shown to be biased, to be discriminatory, right? There's got to be maybe some kind of licensing or some kind of certification. Just like now, you can't build a building and call it, green space without some kind of certification. That would also bring accountability both from the public and from journalists. And I would say those are the three areas looking in the next 2 or 3 years where that's going to play out a lot.
And to add to that, I mean, I think to maybe reiterate something I said earlier, I think if there are no standards for testing of these systems or expectations of testing or assessment, what that looks like exactly is something we can talk about. What an auditor of an algorithm is supposed to be certified in being able to do, we can talk about. Should they have kind of a fiduciary, role to the public as opposed to the right now? The higher view example is one because the auditing algorithm the algorithm was audited by a company that was hired by higher view, right? So like who's gonna audit them? What's an auditor? What's an algorithm? These are all things that I think today there aren't a lot of standards around. And so, if we are going to get to a place where we're able to understand what the algorithm's actually doing in the world, then we need the testing. And that's part of the reason why I think I cited, I think his name's Andrew Moore. I think he's the head of AI for Google Cloud. And he said something along the lines of like 90% of the AI development pipeline in the future will be testing, because we need some sort of understanding of what any of this is doing, or at least if you're going to use it in a democratic society, we got to get to a point where that's our our standard. Prove it. AI is great, but prove it.
That's right.
Yeah. We have a question in the chat about getting news managers, particularly in TV, Israel. Obviously, you mentioned before the difference between print and TV. This comes from Rebecca Aguilar, and I certainly know where she's coming from, that TV producers might be rolling their eyes because you can very quickly get bogged down in things that are boring and dry and not sexy for TV. How do you pitch this in ways that are attractive to something as fast-paced as TV?
I mean, for me, I start with the basic models, right? This is, again, I mentioned this. How is this impacting my money, my family, my children, my community? Is there some kind of moral outrage, right? These are the things that TV reporters, when I used to work in TV, we would have this poster of this woman, and believe it or not, we called her Karen. And we did for no reason. This was like 4 years ago, so it was nothing to do with Karen. And Rebecca she might have experienced this as well. But when we pitched stories, we had to pitch stories to a mom of two who's 37 years old, who is working, and she's coming home and she doesn't have time for a minute 45 package, right? It's got to be a minute 15. And we would have to pitch that story. So what I would say is, don't play to the fear of the AI and the algorithms are coming to get you. But I would say this is impacting your right to know. This is impacting your community because it's impacting people. I would say there's a sense of moral outrage. Carrie just said it, right? We need to make sure that these powerful programs are doing right by us. So the way that I would pitch, Rebecca, to the producers is to say, look, I've got a great sweeps piece. I don't think these pieces are going to run in the 11 o'clock newscast because, we're worried about the remote control at 11 o'clock, right? But I would say these are highly promotable pieces for TV. It's perfect because you can play out November sweeps and February sweeps of 2022. So I would say two approaches. Number one, this is watchdog journalism. And producers and news directors love watchdog journalism, okay? This is holding government accountable, right? Working for you. We're on your side. These are all the mottos that Michael and I are familiar with in television. And the next thing is we've got to explain the future to you now. And so for me, I think simplifying it and saying, this is happening right here, right now, right here, now, urgent. And this decisions that are being made impacting your community, but it's not a mayor. It's not a city councilman. It's a computer. And we got to show that in graphic, right? And so therefore, I would say process language is very important. You've got to explain to people, here's the process of how we're trying to hold government accountable, but they're not letting us see the computer. That's one. And then two, talk about behind the scenes, what you're trying to do, working for you. I think if you're approaching it from an IRE watchdog journalism and you're trying to simplify the science and the math, I think those are great sweeps pieces.
Yeah, and moving from print to TV, I can tell you it's very different pitching a story for TV than print. But Kari, I mean, you work for you do online print but you do it for a specialty website at that. But I'm sure even there, you have to kind of approach it somewhat the way Israel is. You can't just get too dry and wonky because you're really going to narrow Israel was
I suppose I could, but I try not to. I mean, what Israel touched on before is really, I'm absolutely not in TV, but I think in any context of journalism, when I can tell you the name of the person who was impacted in that first sentence, you're in a good place. I'm talking to you about, here is the person directly impacted. When you can get to that place, that's good. I can't always do that in business journalism, but that's solid. Yeah, I mean, beyond that, hold on, what was the question? Accountability.
Yeah, I mean, just sort of, for some of the, maybe on the print side, but still trying to pitch this to an editor who's not versed in this, finds it boring, thinks you're going to start getting bogged down in numbers.
Yeah. I think, the thing that I've tried to focus on over the years is really understanding the great degree to which how we consider what's ethical is absolutely based on power. And so I think unpacking that sometimes is important when you're talking about your government using it. Certainly, that's imperative. But yeah, I think I've tried to take a look at how the power dynamics play into all of these things. The technology being deployed, who it's most likely to harm, and paying attention to that, I feel like is very valuable. And really, and on the tech journalism side, I feel like it almost inverts a lot of what coverage in technology journalism used to be. It's like I'm far more interested in the person who's harmed by this than the person who's like got some earbuds. It's just I don't understand what else could be more valuable than to go after understanding the different ways that this can lead to harm. And the last thing I would say, though, is that there are lots of different ways that you can define how this can harm people. It's not just bias and discrimination. There are also, as I said before, issues of national security or things of that nature that come into play. And there are surveys of on the business side. Yeah, we know. That it's true. I don't know on the government side, but efforts to mitigate harm caused by deploying algorithms aren't really being taken that serious by business leaders. And we can all wait around and see how that impacts society.
And can I plug in Carrie? Because I've been reading his stories. So for print reporters who are watching this, definitely go to VentureBeat, read some of his pieces. But here's one that he wrote, right, with the big headline, "Building AI for the Global South," right? I mean, 6 words, boom, you got me. Subheadline is "AI Getting Used Responsibly in Healthcare." And this is AI tends to fall most heavily on marginalized communities. I'm hooked on this article right off the bat. So I think for print reporters, you've got space. You've got 1,000 words. You've got 1,500 words. You can start showing step by step, right? You take the concerns that Michelle has outlined. You take the signs that Michael is talking about. And you print journalists are really good at going point by point by point to say, hey, everybody, we really need to pay attention. So read Kari's articles. He's done a great job on the print side.
Thanks.
So, nice job, seriously.
Thank you.
We've certainly been going for a while now, so I'll just wrap it up by seeing if any of you have any closing thoughts or advice for our attendees.
My advice is just tell these stories. Algorithms are not abstract things. They are human made and they impact humans. They are human interest stories. They implicate human rights, civil rights, values of democracy. Like, if those aren't sexy topics, then we should all quit our jobs right now, because they are so, fundamental to what it means really to be a citizen of the world right now. So I don't get so bedazzled by the tech talk. A human made it and it's impacting humans. And so that is my advice to you all. And thank you for the amazing work you do in shining a light on these systems.
Well said.
For me, I am a faculty advisor to the student newsroom, and we do pitches for stories every Tuesday, and students will come in and they'll pitch a story, and they always know that if I raise my hands like this, it means, why should I care, right? Why do I care about your story? And I force them to sell it to me. And what I tell them is, think globally, but act locally. And so if you're going to pitch this beat, if you're going to pitch the stories, do the things that we do well for. Voice for the voiceless, right? That's great. Accountability, right? That's always great. And explanation. Explanatory journalism is a great area for journalists to really dive deep into, especially print journalists. So I think you're going to have to answer the question, why should I care? But Michelle just told it to you. And if you want more explanation, read Carrie and definitely watch Michael's pieces. But without a doubt, this is an area of growing concern. People were talking about this in 2012. So that tells you where we're at.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess the only things I would say is, I think I do try and follow the trends in this space, and one of the things that came out in a report a couple of weeks ago was something along the lines of mentions of artificial intelligence in Congress are at an all-time high. It's the same thing with the Parliament in the UK. There's a lot of different governments trying to understand how to properly deploy this or regulate it. I'm not sure anyone's keeping up very well, but it's encouraging if journalists become more scrutinizing of these things out there. I believe it was Dr. Sophia Noble, who'd written Algorithms of Oppression, who said something along the lines of that this will be a major human rights issue of the 21st century. And I think we really have to start thinking about it that way, and thinking about how it impacts each community. Michelle, said it so eloquently, how all the different clients are impacted. I think there's people who are afraid that this technology is going to be used to, frankly, hunt their children, as it relates to predictive policing and things of that nature. The false arrests that have taken place as a result of the use of facial recognition, there's no standards for any of these things. And so I think there's a lot of that's going to be happening on the policy side that we all have to keep paying attention to and asking these questions and serving our readers and communities.
Yeah, the machines, it's probably a while before the machines become self-aware and rise up against us, but there's still a lot of stories there. And I'll just conclude this by, again, referring back to the tool that we just posted yesterday, on reporting on algorithmic transparency. There's a lot of advice today. This is being recorded. That tool is up there. Certainly refer back to these resources anytime you get stuck for some guidance and some help, because this is, as our panelists have said, this is really the next frontier in transparency and in governing. So a lot of important work to be done. And we thank you to our panelists for all of the insight that you provided today. And thank you to all of our attendees for watching.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Michael.
Sorry, pleasure.
Thanks.
Pleasure.
So good to be in conversation with you all.
Likewise.
Thanks.
Have a good evening.